That was quick. And so this was to kind of want to give us sort of a, from the conversation, sort of a proposal. Is that, and Bill or John, do you want to? John, I'll hand the floor to you, then give to Emily.
Well, just in the interest of
Let me try this.
giving,
This usually works.
having the board give Emily as much direction as it's ready to give her,
Yes.
because I know she's eager to keep this thing moving. I just pulled together what I thought I was hearing from everybody. Can you put that screen up, Emily?
Yes. I added it to your slides today so that anyone in the public who's thoroughly confused by what we did can hopefully
Great, thank you.
understand. Okay.
So basically, I took the sort of apples, kumquats, and all of that stuff together. That follows pretty closely to the language of the statute's directions to us. And so for the first two, academic excellence and equity results, we're talking about using the measures from the ESSA snapshot for each school. And for each of those measures, a school gets rated either not meeting, approaching, meeting, or exceeding the standard. And those are the four choices. And so I thought for simplicity's sake, we just assigned a simple number to each of those. I'm looking at the first two rows there, equity and academic excellence. I guess I could point.
Oh, boy.
Oh my.
About that.
Why didn't I have that?
Ain't that something? So
Can you take that away from me?
I'm just looking at this stuff here, and this is from ESSA. And so if you're approaching, that is to say, you're not, these are quartiles. So the midpoint or meeting standards is here. Now, whether that's average or not, I don't know if we can say. We don't know that the average school meets. That's a separate question we don't actually care about. Let's just assume that the midpoint is about here and about here. That is a score of 1.5 if you were the average school. The next two, equity burden, which is what Emily was trying to get at with her category 5 at the bottom of her table, and which Bill and others have been trying to sensitize us to, which is that, these schools that have high density of children who face special challenges have a burden, number one, in that their score results are acutely affected by that status. And for that matter, their costs in staffing are likely to be under pressure as well by this. The burden being the percentage of students who are ELL, free and reduced lunch, maybe spec ed, there may be a category I'm missing. And so the idea here was to simply compute a percentage of students into this equity burden line is simply a percentage. This is not, let me back up, this is not using ESSA for equity or student to staff. It's using readily available data. Every school has, we have a number of the percentage of these students in this category. You might want to have a dialogue among yourselves as to exactly what are the categories to be considered challenge, but clearly it's FRL, probably it's ELL, and maybe it's a special ed. That's for you to decide.
And I think, John, if I could do you one favor,
yeah.
I think I would have switched this word burden if I'd had more time to
Yeah.
hardship, because we don't want to make
Hardship.
people think these students
Yeah,
are a burden,
okay.
right?
Or-
That's not
or-
what we're saying.
Yeah. Challenge. Good point. It's
We're just thinking fast.
yeah, right. Oh, it's all in the words. And there's a great saying that if we can't get the words right, how will they ever trust us with the ideas? And so anyway, so in this challenge, we simply characterize all the schools in the state and divvy them up into quartiles, which is, I mean, simple math. And if your school is in the second quartile, you get 1 point. That is to say, you're probably slightly below average. Here, you're slightly above average in terms of the density of these needs at your school. Here, you have a very high density of these needs at your school, and you should be not rewarded for that, but recognized for that. That's what I think the legislature was trying to get us to do. And then finally, student-to-staff ratios, we just used a simple notion here. Now, there are probably different ways to compute this. You all can decide how you want to do it, but the idea is, again, every school, it ought to be pretty easy to calculate what the student-staff to ratio is in every school, divvy it up by quartiles, and you get a number. In the case of these quartiles, the median, or at least the mean, is right here. So the mean score for would be 1.5 points. So it's kind of interesting that if you want to know, so what is average? Probably average is this line right here. 1.5 points, 1.5 points, 1.5 points, 1.5 points. That is to say, it's probably 6 or maybe it's 7. Maybe it's meeting, and 1.5.
And that's the
1.5.
median, actually, right?
Pardon?
The line down the middle is the median.
It would be the
Most-
median.
Yeah.
The reason I put
Most
the
cases.
star on student to staff ratio quartile 2 is my thinking of, or my interpretation of John's idea is that when you come to ratios, you aren't taking the median, right? You really have a number and you're above or below it. So I think you'd put the state's calculated average student to staff ratio as the mark for quartile 1. Meaning that and this is up to you guys, but you could think about where to put the average. So did you want to allow more room to be slightly below it and still get a point? Or did you want to leave more room to be well above the average and get more
So you weren't
points?
thinking of that as just a ranked variable, that's
See,
what I thought.
I would just do simply a ranked variable. Just rank them.
To list all,
Just list them all.
the
I
ratios.
mean,
and
we have that data
okay.
already.
Yeah,
Just go to
okay,
the
I get
table and find the breakpoints.
Yeah, you get 100, 1 through 25, 26 through 50, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I thought that's what you meant in terms of equity as well, like the
Yeah.
percentage. of-
Exactly.
Works
So
for me.
the challenge, the equity burden, this one, are both just give us the raw numbers and break the distribution into quartiles.
Yeah,
And then assign these points based on that. And I'm not proposing to you today to try to reach agreement about what's a passing grade. I think we have accomplished something useful if we had simply agreed on something like this. If not this exactly, then something like it, so that Emily can stop having to give us all these options and can start to give us some thinking about what ought to be the threshold grade. And a possible, just for hypothetical discussion purposes, if you thought that what the legislature was saying was, we want to recognize small schools that are at the median or more or less. I'm not speaking with Bill's rigor here when I say this. I'm just talking layperson's middle of the road here, which would be around 6 points. The other notion is that there's a bonus point for having stood up for the American flag. That is for participating in some kind of exercise. And so this does what John O'Keefe recommended, which was don't point a stick in the eye of the legislature and say, we ain't thinking about that. We are thinking about it and we're recognizing it here, but we're not giving it a great deal of weight. It could push somebody over the threshold, which is fine, because that shows that they did undertake some kind of good faith enterprise that the legislature happens to think is very important. Where the number ought to be, I haven't any idea. That's for you all to figure out. But just get some agreement on this. Now, yes, and Emily left that question open down here for you.
Okay, hold on, so we have Oliver and then we get to Peter.
So,
And then, oh.
clarification.
Oh, you have a clarification, because
Yeah.
Bill helped make this, so if we could let Bill go and then.
Student to staff ratio gets tricky. That's the only one which isn't exactly linear. If you look at the research literature, there's a curve in there where you have the most effective student to teacher to student ratio. Staff, I can't tell you. But it's hovers around 12 or 13. But we could probably work out the distribution in such a way that we could have the quartiles for excessively high or excessively low
Uh-huh.
Right.
and combine them in that kind of fashion, which would make the scale work.
So that would almost put the asterisk at number 4, right?
I think I should
Yeah.
delete my asterisk. I think you should all ignore my asterisk.
But that would,
right now.
Bill, from what you're saying, it would put that over in 4, and then there'd be a high-low going down the.
Yeah, I think it deserves an asterisk because it is a little bit unusual.
Yeah, it is, but what we're not being asked by the legislature to judge what is the optimum ratio. They proposed student to staff ratio as a proxy for what they called operational efficiency. That was the language they used, was operational
Which
efficiency.
is an
And the
assumption.
only measure they offered for that was student to staff ratio.
I like your per pupil spending better.
I do
Yes.
too, but
Yeah.
it's not what they asked for. They explicitly asked for student to staff ratio. I mean, I think they misspoke and all that. It's your call as to whether you want to disregard their language and say, this is what you really meant, isn't it? In which case, student staff ratio, cost per student is truly much more reflective of operational efficiency.
Well, we can extend and improve their conversation, you see.
Well, that's your call.
I mean, that's another line, could be another line.
Well, don't do another line.
Not another
Just,
line.
No,
just say, look, you asked for operational efficiency, here's the right metric.
I like doing another line, but if you took all the points and multiplied by 2 and then kept the student to staff ratios the same and then spending per pupil. So the top line would be
All right.
0, 2, 4, 6, and then, no, it's actually easier than it seems, and then student staff ratio would stay exactly the same and per pupil would be exactly the same.
I see what you're
So you're not weighting those anymore, but we're also
Oh,
inserting
divvy
that,
it.
that number in there.
I see what you're saying.
All right, Oliver, you have your.
So I've got 3 points of question and an alternative proposal. So first, just when we're talking about equalized spending per pupil, I would agree. I think student to staff ratios is not a great metric. If you really want to get to operational efficiency, the ultimate metric is the dollar. The only caveat I would put there is we need to be careful with equalized spending per pupil, because equalized spending per pupil includes categorical grants, including the small schools grants. So you have to take that out to really provide a better comparison. Second point is just going and looking at the statutory language and going back to Act 46 and how it flows from Act 46 and the goals as they're enumerated, and just principles of statutory construction. I think we have to be real, just as we separated driving times, and then there's an or, then there's academic excellence and operational efficiency of the school. And then there are these 4 criteria, and I think that we have to be careful. I think, and this is something we should seek legal counsel on, but I think we need to be careful about commingling the 4 categories. I think we need to look at categories 1 and 2 as one bucket, and categories 3 and 4 as a separate bucket. And because of the word "and," the criteria in both buckets need to be met separately.
So you have to get, 4 in the first category and a 4 in the second category.
Whatever the threshold that you set in
Set,
each
yeah,
of those
just
2
as an
buckets.
example,
Each
yeah.
of those 2 buckets. So I think we probably want to task, whether it's Don or somebody else.
Oh, hi, I'm
Hey,
an
hey,
attorney.
Emily.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, you're an
Oh,
attorney.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
thought you worked for SBE.
No,
No,
I
I'm confused.
No,
I have
no,
a new
new
job
job.
and
New
sorry,
job,
Oliver,
okay,
I
never
should have
mind,
gone through
okay.
the whole thing. I'm an assistant attorney
Got
general at
it,
the
okay,
Agency
okay,
of
so
Education.
I'm sorry,
Hello.
I'll
So no, I'm not stressing out that much about that. And I think it's they listed 4 Roman numerals in the same list, and
Okay.
you guys frequently would say operational efficiency by A and B, and academic excellence by A and B when you really wanted to tease things apart. I see these as all 4 considerations on equal footing.
Okay, so, okay, so with that said, question for the acting secretary, how feasible do you think it would be for the agency to support this kind of data structure in a way that was bulletproof?
Oh, well, very easily. I mean,
Okay.
we already are going to have the academic excellence and the first indicator of equity. It's part of the state
Yep.
report card. And then the equity burden, which I would agree is not the right
Changing that.
category at all, or phrase at all, we would use free and reduced lunch percentages.
I think that's a question still in front of you.
Or we could. Here's what I would propose that I think would make it easy. Student to staff ratio, as we've talked about,
Yep.
we easily have that. We would want to figure out what we want in
Yep.
that ratio, because there are different ways to conceptualize.
And
So, so my-
Brad,
oh, sorry.
sorry, just because you would not have heard Brad's presentation 2 meetings ago, he got together a list of positions that make the most sense to be excluded from the ratio, and he can
Okay.
present that again if you need him to.
So the third point I wanted to make was, this assumes that it's a comparison against a statewide cohort. And my concern there is that you've got a lot of urban numbers mixed in with rural numbers, and the challenge with a lot of these smaller schools, they're typically more rural. So I think we might want to consider looking at comparing against a cohort that's more applicable, if you will. So one thing might be to start looking at how that district compares against its peers within the same SU, as an example, which leads to an alternate proposal in the spirit of just trying to simplify a little bit. What I was going to propose is that on Roman numeral 1, we simply make that binary. Do they meet the EQS or not? If they don't meet EQS, they're not eligible. If they are, then they move on to the next one, which is I would propose looking at the academic proficiency of FRL students and whether it's equal to or higher than the average academic proficiency of FRL students within the same SU for the same grades. And then if that works, then look at staff-student ratios of the average in the same SU. And then the question is, are you above or below that average? And then the question around the merger proposal, the merger proposal could add some sort of a buffer to any one of those other metrics.
I think, because that was one of the first iterations, wasn't it? The yes, no.
Yes,
And
that's
then
why I
moved away.
smiled at you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's
That was
why I
one
was
of the
smiling
first-
over, because that's where we started with
That's
yes,
where we
no,
started,
and
and then it moved into this. So that's what it was that, and then we morphed into something else. And
And
I mean,
then-
people can speak to that. I think it was that a yes or no based on the EQS and the involved test scores. But if we didn't consider that with the idea of how many students were in poverty, because poverty affects the test scores, is that a legitimate way to measure that? So that's where this move, that's where the conversation started, and it's sort of evolved from then. But people can say whether or not where we want to go.
I would really rather go to cost per pupil. The whole student to staff ratio today is, I mean, you've got everybody coming out of the central office, you'd have to do what percentage of FTE and we're coming, it's not all school-based by any means anymore in terms of.
With all due respect, could you stay on the proposal specifically that was just presented by Oliver?
Okay, I agree up until then.
Okay, so
everything up until that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I appreciate Oliver's proposal, I would want a little bit of time to figure out what that would mean in terms of capacity, because it would mean doing, recasting the comparisons that are already built in to the system, and making those intergeographic, within the SU comparisons. And so I would just want to maybe come back and say, talk to the team and see if that was something that might be reasonable or not.
Yeah. My primary concern is I think if we start comparing against a statewide cohort, we're going to get perverse results in some districts, and it's going to be the luck of the draw. And it's not, quite frankly, I don't think it's going to be equitable. I think we're going to find that there's some districts that are going to continue to get a small school grant that probably shouldn't, and then others who are more deserving on an equity basis that don't, because they're being compared against a statewide cohort rather than something that's a little bit more.
Well, what if we just tossed out the really big schools?
Well, I think that's getting to.
No, just the really big ones. I mean, I know Oliver's point, but then you don't really have much to compare
Well,
it
can we
to.
get Emily?
Oh.
I think she
There's
has
just
some.
there's something that I happen to know about the snapshot because I had to learn it a little in order to present it to you, and it actually is pretty responsive to what Oliver is saying. So one, I learned during the break that they call this fullest one, the bagel, which led me to name this one the Montreal style bagel, and this one the bracelet, and this one the cookie. Okay, so maybe I was.
You
just
need the
trying to-
pointer from John.
Yeah, I need the pointer from John. So one thing about the snapshot is that for an individual school building, this is ignoring district lines, within an individual school building, you'll have an indicator of how you are doing compared to other schools in your SU across indicators for the snapshot. So I don't know whether Oliver's specific point can be demonstrated, but something pretty close to it I believe can. So if you were looking at the equity indicator, if you had a bracelet, which is not fabulous and would get you probably 0 points if we're using John's scale. If your whole SU had the same indicator, the bracelet, or not exceeding, does that tell us something different rather than maybe the whole state is meeting on that indicator? There is something in the snapshot that does that.
All right, Myra.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but as we're going forward with this, you're gonna have the individual schools within larger school districts now. So when you say you want to eliminate schools, but I think part of what the legislature is looking at is how are all schools doing compared to each other, including the larger schools with high or low FRL. And so I think it is important to compare the rural schools of like schools, even though they might be coming from a larger school district now.
But here's where where I was drawn to the SU is, you're totally right. The challenge though is that realistically, if you're in one part of the state and you're comparing against the overall state and you're comparing against a larger school, let's say up in Chittenden County, you don't have, if you closed your school or wanted to merge schools, that's not even an option. So that's why I'm saying I think you need to compare against what your peers are that are within the same basic area. So in other words, the question is, why do you continue to operate the school when there might be right next to you a school that provides better opportunities, more efficient, et cetera? I think that's really the core question.
Well, I think you get to that question when you fail this test, and then you're going back as a school board member and you're explaining to your community why you didn't get the small schools grant, and you start investigating it. Now, granted, it's going to hit you that year when you're trying to pass a budget and you don't have the small schools grant to be able to put into the budget. But I think that's where it goes back to the local conversation, and then you start having that larger conversation and what other options, and there's going to be help from the AOE to be able to have those conversations. But I think this gets to that greater question. I don't think, we're not talking about closing schools here, although we're not ignorant to the fact that the consequences to not getting a small schools grant is a higher tax rate for that community if all things remain the same.
Bill's been waiting very patiently.
First, Oliver's requirement that it be bulletproof, it's not going to be met by anything. We know that from the beginning. in terms of accounting for all of those factors, and I think we should, but I proposed a regression equation which would take into consideration every one of the things you mentioned, and that played to boos and hisses and moans and groans because it's too complicated. But that's, if you want to do it, that's the way to do it. And I would argue that we need to look at the state as a whole because the Brigham decision in 16 VSA 1 says every kid in the state must have a substantially equal opportunity. So we must treat everybody in the state in somewhat of a substantially equal way. But we can make the adjustments with the regression kind of thing. Another thing I would mention on this thing is that these are performance achievement levels. And that's much better in this case for this kind of purpose because it is apples and kumquats, but if you did some of this other fancy dancing with regressions to take into account, you'd have to use different assumptions.
And I guess, John, if you want to go back, because you proposed this, you've heard a lot of comments, so what are you thinking now?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very good discussion. I really admire the thought processes that you guys are using. And I'm frankly agnostic on these questions. I'm just, because I think you have an understanding of the schools and the supervisory unions in a way that I do not. So I don't have anything to add. I was just looking to get to something simple that we could sign up for today and move forward. But if you want to pull back and look at the supervisory union as the context, I don't have the horsepower to say why not. I think you ought to sort that out. But whatever you do, we need to do it pretty quick.
Yeah.
You know,
John?
I can support this. I mean, I like calling it the Mathis Carroll matrix, just for historic purposes.
I'm not sure he's so signed up.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, that's why I put him first.
I don't know, maybe if we both vote
Mathis
this, should we
Carroll.
vote for it?
But yeah, I mean, I think it works. You know, I also understand, you know, the concern I have with the supervisory union is some are big, some are small.
Are they on the edge of another one?
Yeah, on the edge of another one, I'm just trying to think through, like, you know, some of them and how they're structured and whether you'd have an unfair advantage in one supervisory union versus another. If you're in a weaker supervisory union where the overall achievement is lower, then you could be really a high performer in that low-performing supervisory union.
Well, the driver is socioeconomics. When you're talking about what's going to predict these scores the best, that's what it's going to be. Some of the stuff in terms of the effects of central offices on achievement test scores comes out as very little.
Yeah, well, I mean, whatever we come up with is going to be somewhat flawed. I mean, any program where you put it through a formula is gonna have its ups and downs. I've never seen the perfect system. This does seem to get to what the legislative intent was. Student to staff ratio, that one just seemed a little squishier. I know the legislation had that in there, but you know, I can see, you know, just based on what who was the gentleman that put together the list of Brad James. Depending on who we put in there, or how schools have structured themselves, or supervisory unions, you know, some supervisory unions have more staff dedicated to the supervisory union, so do you include them or not? The per pupil spending just seems really rock solid. You take the overall number and divide by the number of students, and that's what you got.
Well, you know, I agree with that up to a point. Per pupil spending is somewhat driven by where in the state your school district is. And
True.
and so there, and that's a history of how schools have negotiated with their teachers and so forth.
Pay scales.
Cost of living.
Yeah, and cost of living. So I mean, the fact that you have student-staff ratio with some kind of blend to student per student spending, I do kind of like your idea. I understand what you're saying when you take that take that horizontal line and you split it in two.
Yeah,
We'll just add another line.
You can add another line.
Bump your
just
score to
so that
15.
You're, so that, you're gonna split that student staff and that per equalized student, but at least it'll maybe balance it out a little.
I have a question for a potential complication. I might answer my own question. There are some districts in the state that are very small, and they operate, under one district, they operate a school for certain grades, and then under the same district pay tuition for, say, 7th and 8th grade. I'm not sure that any of them are on this list because it just occurred to me. If that were the case, I assume, you'd want to back out their spending on what they actually spend per student in a school that they operate, because their whole budget that their electorate votes on in those cases also reflects the payment of tuition to wherever their kids are going, say for 7th and 8th grade, which isn't tied necessarily to the operational decisions they've made in the school that's seeking the grant. I might be worrying about something that's not actually evident in the list of schools that would be applying, but it would be a wrinkle.
But isn't there a relationship to schools that are or kindergarten 4, 6, 8, or whatever, and then they tuition beyond that? That the only control that the taxpayers have on that tuitioning rate is how they pass and not pass budgets, and that in the elementary level. In other words,
Well, yeah,
sometimes
necessarily.
the elementary students are being cheated so that there's a higher tuition rate that goes. And are we
They don't have
factoring
control.
in that in this at all?
It
Because you might
just
have
raised the
low
question,
per
it's
pupil
all.
spending.
So can we just go around with our people, I'm hearing comfort with this, and maybe some tweaks that Emily is listening to us talk about. And, we haven't, are people fairly comfortable with this with some adjustments that we've talked about, like this idea of the scale and these categories? I mean, I think that's the most important part, is that these measures that we're using, are people okay? It also wants to start the conversation, if this is what we want to move towards, and there is there's a total of 12 points, and as John was saying, the line itself will be 6 points. So is that what you're saying, somewhere would be 6 out of 12 points would get you the small school grant? Is that what people, and John, is that what you were proposing?
I'm not sure. I would add John's suggestion about a 5th line, which is staff to student. Cost per equalized student or something that's. And I'd add that so that the total maximum possible score is 15. But to me, I think to answer your question, I think it's a question of what do you think the legislature was trying to do? Are they just trying to ask that a small school qualify for this grant by being average, or were they asking a small school to qualify for this grant by being better than average? They
Which gets us
don't
into-
appear to have been asking them to qualify by being less than average.
That gets to Lake Wobegon. When you put it, remember again, their unit is the school, not kids.
Understood?
We're not gonna have everybody above average.
No, but a school may have, for example, a school may have an academic measure that is above average in the state.
Yeah.
That's all we're talking about when we talk about average. So each of these is referencing the state or the SU, whichever the frame of reference is. The question is, what did the legislature have in mind, or what does the language of the statute tell us? It talks about academic excellence, and it talks about operating efficiency. And you wouldn't call something that is average efficient, I don't think, and I don't think you would call something that is average excellent. I mean, sort of by definition, those are better than the mean. So my first inclination is to say that the score ought not to be 6. That's in a sense a rewarding mediocrity, and I'm not sure that's what the legislature had in mind. It ought to be something more than 6, What that is, I don't know.
I think we're gonna have to play it out some and do some modeling of this, because we don't know where those measures are skewed and what effect that would have in terms of the score, and whether it's gonna be the 6 that we're hypothesizing, or whether it turns out it's 9 or 3. I don't know.
Can we go Oliver and then Peter, right?
So I would recommend on the cost per student, I think that should be a recommendation we send to the legislature, but I think we need to be really careful that we not include that, because we are constrained by the 4 criteria that we were given by the legislature, and there's no mention of cost per student there, so I think we would be exceeding our authority by including that, and could therefore create problems down the road.
Well, I hate to go back to consider, but I don't, that's where I started with all this, and I didn't see it was, we were bound when you were using the word consider in regards to these items that they wanted us to review. And I know that we spent a lot more time on this subject than they ever did, and here we are.
Preface with shall.
Yeah, or notwithstanding, yeah.
But I mean, that may be, as Oliver said, that might be something that, as we propose moving forward, that we could have a list of things that we think should be
Yeah.
considered. And
Or if we did everything as that they asked, and then we did ask, we did include the student, the cost per student, I mean, what harm would that?
Well, to answer that as your lawyer, the person giving legal advice, if a school were not awarded their grant and they feel that but for the consideration of that cost mechanism they would have been awarded, they'd sue you and make their argument in court about getting their money and overturning your metrics.
Right.
That's always what can happen.
So,
Well, what's your legal, do you think that there would be merit to such an argument?
Yeah, there's some merit. I wouldn't be the judge in the case, somebody else would be, but yeah,
Maybe
that's,
someday, but
yeah, I mean, I've been telling you all along, the closer you hew to the statute, the legally safer you are.
I agree with all of it.
I don't necessarily disagree that, that the safest route is not to include it. I don't find not including it. The legislative intent is an old interpreting the dreams of pharaohs. That's how the court once described legislative intent. But I think that this does have I think this does comply with legislative intent. I wouldn't, my bottom number isn't 6 though, I would say it's at least 7 or 8, based on, the legislative intent. When I'm reading the statute, it doesn't look like it's a 6. Basically half the points that are eligible, plus the bonus. 7 seems like really the closest, the lowest number I can go. If you look at things like educational excellence and operating efficiency, that doesn't seem like that's an average number.
Well, at this point, we're throwing darts, because again, we don't know what these things are gonna shake out, this kind of matrix, and how we measure it.
I disagree with that, we're setting a standard here and saying that when people qualify for the standard, they will get additional aid. They're actually getting additional money.
No,
based on-
actually, that extra money is allowing them to spend at the state average. It would be taking away, and that's how.
No, I don't agree with that, these are school districts that are getting additional money from the state above and beyond. There's a small schools grant that other schools don't qualify for, so I don't totally agree with that logic.
Well, only a judge would be able to determine that.
Okay, John?
Well, back to Oliver's concern and then your responses to it and Emily's. The question of hewing to the strict letter of the statute is something that we're going to be grappling with very, very heatedly over the next 6 months. And so what we do here, it seems to me, it might be helpful if what we do here is consistent with what we hope to do when it comes to our work in the state plan. We already heard this morning and this afternoon a lot of talk about what the intent of the law is and what Act 60 meant and all of that. And we can get into that if we want, or we can take a more narrow view of the mandate in front of us by the legislature with regard to Act 46. And ditto with regard to this. And so I think on keeping in mind that this sort of past this prologue and what we do today we will be held accountable for in the future, including if we become inventive here, we'll be asked to be inventive later. And I think being inventive later is going to be really a problem for us. So I'm inclined to err on the side of a scrupulous response to the legislative directive and pull back from inventiveness about, they were stupid, they should have asked us for this. No, they didn't. They did it their way and they are the authority.
And we can still recommend, and I think that's the key, is we recommend
Yeah.
that you make these changes and.
Yeah,
we-
yeah. Have to do consideration and
Yeah.
the response. Next January, we can go back in with a proposal for modification of the language if we deem it so.
To Peter's point, I think we've probably spent much more time discussing these metrics than the legislature did.
And don't forget the legislator didn't want to do this. That's why they sent it to us.
So we'll do our best and.
Right, and I think that gets us to put, because I'm hearing people want to move using this or, teasing out the information, but I think the big question now becomes the points. And what qualifies you, and as we talked about earlier, whatever we put into place, we don't get to go back and fix. So that is the hard pill to swallow, is, if you go higher, there could be different results. And are we modest in what we're putting forward? Because if you look at that third quintile, that's a range of schools that are falling within there. And so you could be just below it and you get the 1 point, but then you could be almost into 3 for the next one, but you still only get 2 points. So there is a degree of what do we want to make sure that we're getting schools the resources that we need.
And one other point, and not to further complicate this, because I was advocating simplifying it, but this is just looking at the past year, correct?
3 years.
Oh, it is a 3-year roll.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you have one bad, we talked about that.
Yeah,
previously.
okay.
If you have one bad year, it doesn't totally tank you.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, Chrissy, could I make a motion? Actually, a preliminary one, so that Emily can get some work done between now and the
You
next
can
meeting?
make a motion, we'll see somebody say, yeah, so
Alright,
what's your
well.
motion?
I'd make a motion to authorize Emily to put this matrix based on 7 points into something that is a final form so we can consider it at the next meeting. And actually draft it into some sort of regulation.
Okay, do we wanna do a vote on this, or is this something that we wanna?
I think we need to send people away from this meeting with some expectation that we're gonna go in a direction, because at the next meeting, we're gonna come to a crisis point where we're gonna have to do something, and I don't think that's fair to the schools that are concerned about this, or anybody at this table. Or Emily, who is going to spend the whole retreat writing up something that we come up with at the first hour of the meeting.
Okay, so could you
So,
restate your motion, sorry?
So a vote to authorize AOE, legal staff, to incorporate this matrix with 7 points as the minimum threshold into a draft final regulation that we can consider at our June 20th meeting. Is that when we're meeting again, the retreat?
The 27th.
27th. Because at that point, it's gonna be if we don't have some direction leaving here, it's gonna be a crisis at the 27th meeting.
I'll second.
Okay, so, and Mark,
So that's 7 out of,
7 out of 12 points.
Well, 7 out of possible 13.
13,
Well,
right, because we.
12
Yeah.
points, 7 you need to get, but you can pick
12,
up a
13,
bonus.
so
And the bonus point
12
is
plus
the.
13.
We remove the asterisk.
I can do that right now.
Phil,
Yeah, maybe I want to amend this, or maybe a friendly amendment, but I could go along with asking the agency to figure out and work this and develop it, and that would lend the direction. But I don't think we're at the point that we know that 7 points is going to be done.
Well, I'm just putting that in there as a placeholder,
Uh,
just so we have a number there. We could change that at the next meeting, if
Let's-
that's,
Well, we said it.
if
When you
we
say
break it down,
figure
it
this
doesn't
out,
matter.
what do you have in mind, sir?
I would like to see how this thing is going to behave.
he wants to go home and fill out the IBM.
You can't figure it out.
Well, let's say it behaved a certain way. How would you know that that's what the legislature had in mind?
Well, we're assuming the legislature had something in mind when they put this.
I don't think we have any idea what they had in mind. There's nothing in the language that tells us that they want more schools to qualify or less. It's simply not clear. So let's say this tells you you're going to get 38 schools. Well, is that good? Is that better than getting 12? What purpose is served by discovering what this creates?
That's a very good question,
I
Robert.
think,
So why are we creating it?
and having been in the legislature when this law was passed, the language here does provide some signposts. And it's, for example, it doesn't discuss the school's student to staff ratios. It discusses the student's high
Yeah.
student to staff ratios. So there are signposts, and I would agree with Bill to the extent that it's possible. It would be helpful if AOE could provide even just a rough approximation of the number of schools and we don't need to know the names of the schools, it's just a rough approximation. With this formula, give us a range of a percentage that you think, based on your considered judgment, would fall below or above that threshold.
What would you do with that information?
Well, it would be instructive to us if, for example, so what we can discern from legislative intent and the actions of the legislature is they were looking for a mechanism that would push more in the direction of increasing staff to student ratios, but they didn't want to completely eliminate the program, right? If they wanted to eliminate the program, they would have eliminated the program. So if AOE comes back and says, based on these metrics, nobody's going to qualify, we've failed in our job in terms of establishing the metrics, because if that was the intent, they would have just said that. On the other hand, if everybody qualifies, I would argue that we've also failed in our mission, because they're signposting us in a direction to curb the program.
I disagree, though, just from this perspective. I'll give you this example. Our police department has a PT test that they have to take every year. They have to run push-ups themselves. And they always think that I don't want them to pass it because then they get a bonus. And actually, I want every single one of them to pass it. I put this together. My vote on this is I hope every single school gets it. But I'm not of the.
And we get the bonus, yeah.
Yeah, we get the bonus, yeah, exactly.
Well, who passes is going to depend on what you set for a threshold.
Well, and they could, and I also hope that everyone works hard, because if they don't get it in the first year, they actually could get it in the second year.
I would argue it's going to be harder to get it in the second year because you're taking resources away from them.
Yeah, true, yeah, that is true. But yeah, I'm voting on this with the optimistic, I'm not usually an optimistic guy, especially on Friday afternoon, but with the optimistic view that every school is gonna get this small schools grant.
Because they're striving.
That's my hope.
right,
Because that
so-
would mean that everyone's succeeding.
So we have a motion on the table that has been seconded. So other discussion around the motion on the table?
Yes.
Does it move?
Just to move things along, I would amend the motion to delete 7 and keep the other parts of the thing.
Okay, so you've made a motion to instead,
Eliminate the number 7, but have the agency go ahead and do the work. And then we can look back at some approximations and see whether 5, 6, 7, or some other number fits in there.
so is there a second to that?
Can I just ask,
Yeah.
how would that be tested without actually having a number to have the agency test? How are they gonna determine?
We would just give you the, I mean, what we could do is just look at the
6, 7, 8,
distribution
7.
of the 0 to 3 on each of these.
Assuming that, and I am assuming, but I want to flag this for you, assuming that the data underlying the snapshot
Are ready.
on 1 and 2 are ready.
I'm not sure they are.
I haven't
We can
asked that
definitely do it
question.
for
I have no way to know.
we can definitely do it for,
I'm
The
okay
bottom
taking the
two.
number out for now. I really wanna call this the Mathis Carroll matrix, but I don't think I'm gonna get that one. But I'm okay taking the 7 out.
So are
for
you
now.
seconding Bill's
Sure,
motion?
second
So-
is one for now, just to get this thing moving
So yeah, so
ahead.
let's get this moving,
But I
so,
do like, 7's a lucky number, so I have 7 in my
so
head.
the motion is to remove the 7 from the First Amendment. So can we take a
So-
vote on that?
Just to be clear, we're agreeing then on a scoring matrix,
We haven't taken that, we're
but we,
doing
but we
the,
have not agreed on the threshold for being approved.
right.
Correct.
So Bill wants to amend the motion, unless there wants to be a friendly amendment, then we don't have to take a vote.
I'll do a friendly amendment, just let's get
Okay.
it moving.
Okay, so we have a friendly moment to,
Robert's
Take-
rules moment.
yeah,
It's not actual. The motion belongs to the body, and so in order to amend a motion, you actually need a vote of the body once it's been
This
seconded.
Okay,
one-
so you-
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
This is important.
So
I'm so
if
sorry.
you withdrew your motion and re-offered,
I'll withdraw my motion.
okay, you withdraw your motion. Is there any motions to be made?
I'll move that we, same motion, that we authorize Emily and AOE staff to put this matrix into some sort of draft final form with the question open, how many points out of 12 do they need to qualify?
Okay, do we have a second to that motion?
Yeah, then we call it the Mathis Carroll. I'm just kidding about that last part.
Okay, just keep it the second.
Keep
now-
it simple.
Keep it simple, okay. So that is now on the table. Is there any more discussion on that? Or are we ready for a vote? Okay, seeing that we're ready, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. So Emily, we are asking you once again for another, I mean, this is iteration after iteration, so thank you for taking it on again and coming back to us at the 27th at our business meeting.
Do
Yes.
you want to ask, not as part of the motion, but do you want to ask informally that the agency make a horseback estimate as to how many schools would qualify at 7, at 6, at 8, 9? Can you give us a horseback about that?
I
So that
can
we-
definitely, like I just said, sorry.
I'm sorry?
I can definitely for the bottom two, we're less certain about the top two, that we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
the,
And maybe even the
data.
bottom, the bonus point, you probably can tell us that too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
That's, so a maximum, we can know at least half of the indices.
There will
I don't know what you want to do with that information, but it sounds like you want to have it.
There will be 1,000 caveats on anything that we bring you. Don't
Yeah.
worry.
Okay.
and just, I think it's important that it's at an it's aggregated.
yeah.
Yeah, we don't ever want to know
No.
any school names
No.
No.
at all.
All right, so we've gone through everything, and see, I know we were talking at the agenda. I was like, small schools, no way, 45 minutes. So I was glad we had some time added at the end. Anything else of business that needs to come in front of the
So
board?
when are we gonna bring up geographic isolation?
Well, if you want to talk about that as a board now, or we can wait for the next our March meeting. We had said 30 minutes between school to school, but is that something you'd like to discuss? If you want to do it, I mean, you can bring it up now.
Yeah, I'd like to discuss it only because I've done some further research. And I had sort of a deja vu of realizing that Act 153 included language and a request for a report on the small school. It's study on small school grant eligibility due to graphic necessity. And actually, this was just an advisory. It was never instituted. But the curious thing is that while we were talking about mergers, it was always an issue about the small school grants that found its way into this legislation, because there was a faction of the legislature that felt that the small school grants should be curtailed or lessened. So this is an interesting report. And basically, there are some points that were brought up in this, and for instance, on the time measurement, time was measured on approved school bus routes in a school bus with actual stops from the first student pickup to the town school, and then to the next nearest school with capacity. It used 10 miles for distance, 45 miles one way was considered a reasonable amount for young children to be on a bus, thus 1.5 hours for the daily round trip. Both 45 minutes and the miles account for road conditions. Less miles may reflect on poor conditions and may pick up conversely. And conversely, better roads and many pickups could still meet the 45-minute duration. Clearly, they struggled with this. This was Armando's report.
Is this the one he did with Brad, that Brad talked to us about?
Brad and Bill Talbot, I think, drove around.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Actually, in this report, they said they did not drive around that much. They really relied on Google Maps and looking at, they didn't really spend that much time. So, and this sort of sums this up at the end. They said, issue number 6, issues to consider. The methodology used to classify a small school as eligible due to geographic necessity with a combination of objective and subjective observations. As such, the methodology does not lend itself to clear and concise criteria. Legislation is normally drafted so that the basis for selection is not ambiguous nor open to question. The criteria can be tightened by setting specific limits on either time or distance traveled. Exceeding one or other criteria would serve to classify a school as small due to geographic necessity. Geographic necessity is by its very nature is a subjective term, as noted previously. And I think that's exactly where we are today, trying to discuss this. When we said 30 minutes, we pulled that out of the hat, kind of. I mean, it wasn't really, in terms of the impact. And I say, I think most of this is really aimed at elementary schools. I don't think, there aren't many, how many secondary schools are on small school grants? 2.
It's the combined
So-
ones, right?
What's that?
It's the combined schools, I think, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but what I'm saying is that this is really aimed at, this geographic isolation is really aimed at elementary kids on the school bus. How much time should they be on a school bus? And I think their point about 45 minutes is accurate. I mean, that seems to be fair. So I mean, I have some concerns about putting the 30 minutes, but don't forget 30 minutes was from portal to portal, so if you include in the pickup, it could easily be well over an hour by the time you got to a school if you took the cumulative impact of that route. So
This is the one that Brad talked to us about, because he talked about creating a report, and it says for different sort of means, but the
Right.
idea that what this is asking is a little bit different, because what the
I
law is
know
asking here is,
I'm
yes,
talking about the impact.
right.
And so I'm suggesting that we should lessen the 30 minutes because I think that's going to be very, very burdensome on these school routes as they exist. And they're not going to change. They're still going to have to, I mean, some of these towns in the northeast, they have more dirt roads than paved roads, clearly. And people in poverty just can't get their kids to school. They need the school buses to transport them to and from. And so I feel very strongly that 30 minutes is excessive, and I'd like to see it. If I had to make a motion, I'd make it 15 minutes, as it was recommended in this report when it was first written in 2011.
Are you making a motion?
I am.
So is this a motion that you want, because this is for, because we haven't voted out the metrics, that's the next meeting when we have all of them together. So are you saying you want to direct so this is going to be included in
As
when
it
we
for
vote out?
regards to the geographic isolation matter, yeah.
Right, so I guess I just want you to be careful about what we're voting out if you're making a motion, because you're voting for something to propose for the next meeting. Is that what you're making a motion to do?
Or I'll be prepared to present it to the next meeting, if that's what you're asking.
Right, so is that something you want to give, so I guess I'm seeking a clarification, what's the motion, and can you restate it?
I would be glad to make a motion when it's most appropriate, so that it's effective and, in regards to this travel time.
So is that a report or something that you might want included in the packet for everybody to read?
I certainly can, yeah.
No, so that's what, for the
You
June
mean this,
packet?
the report from the 2011
Right.
report? Yeah, that's certainly.
Madam Chair, did we formally adopt the 30-minute rule?
Did we voted on it?
No, so we took a poll because we're gonna add that all together and vote out the metrics all at once. So, I mean, we can,
Polls don't count.
I'm seeing the acting secretary saying, yes, we did formally adopt.
No,
No.
I'm saying
I went
yes,
and
that
looked
was
at
the
the
question I was going to ask.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
We-
think that was the general
I went and
direction
looked
of
at
the
the
board.
minutes again, and it was a consensus of the board,
This
of
was-
everybody going around, but we didn't take a vote because we're waiting to vote the metrics out. So, and,
So it sounds like the motion is to entertain more discussion of the geography.
Well, there's no reason, if we're gonna bring it up at the next meeting for formal
Well-
vote, then
Let's ask, what's the sense of the group?
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess
is
that's-
there interest in 15 as opposed to 30?
so if you remember in our meeting that we met in Montpelier, we, again, were asked to come up with a list of schools before we came up with the metrics. That was part of our charge from the legislature. And so we came up with the idea of 15 minutes, and I think we based that on the fact that students that are going to independent schools are driving 22 minutes on average to go to the school. And so we put it at 15, and then we had a list to give, we had to publish a list, and so we did that. So then when we came back, if you remember, we had Bill and John meet and try to figure out metrics. And then the idea of do we do that from the center of town, but then we went back to the law and it says specifically that it has to be from school to school. So that's when we came up with what is actually geographic isolated. So that's when the idea of 30 came around, we took the poll, and that was the consensus. That 30 meant it was actually isolated, and if you weren't isolated, you went to this other track to go and try to get the, which now we're designing the points, because it was the either or observations. Yeah.
So as a parent of two small kids who spend 30 minutes on the bus, I think 30 minutes is very reasonable. I know a lot of other parents whose kids are on the bus much longer than that, and I don't hear a lot of complaints about it.
but we're talking about elementary kids
Yep.
and 45 minutes.
I know lots of elementary school kids who are on the bus for more than 45 minutes,
Yeah.
and mine are on for 30 minutes, and I don't think it's unreasonable.
So what's the consensus of the group then? So, I mean, you would like it lower.
I would like it lower for anything, because they're, in terms of where I know best, which is northeast and stuff, there's some rugged roads up there, and,
John? I'm just gonna go around, so I just wanna get consensus of kind
I
of like
think
where
I'd
people are.
want to see the report. I'm not convinced yet. And I think it's worth remembering that this isn't the only way that a school can qualify for the grant. It can qualify by being very well run, efficient, and having good results. So I think maybe sort of closing the door a little bit on one side, we've opened it very wide on the other, and I don't want to, I'm willing to stay open-minded until next meeting, but I'd love to see that analysis.
John?
As a parent, and, we have students in my community coming from Danby, they've got to be on the bus for more than 30 minutes. And, those aren't small school students, so 30 to me seems like a good number.
30,
This is, we're
30
talking
minutes?
school to
Yeah.
school. Remember, that's the
Yeah.
I
school
know,
to
the
school.
net effect.
I know, but I'm just, when he was asking, that's what he was saying,
Yeah.
30 minutes on the bus, but I'm just reminding you that school to
Yeah,
school.
but it
But
could
is that
actually
what-
be-
Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it could be less though, actually, because, if you're talking school to school, and actually, the student could actually be, so the school's here, the student's here, and the other school's here, so it actually could be, while it could be more than 30 minutes, it also could be less than 30
Anything
minutes
between
too.
the school and the school, or in terms of this analysis, is not part of this scenario.
Right, no, I was just saying, but from a practical perspective, you do the driving tour that the former commissioner did. You could be 30 minutes school to school, but you also could be, a student actually be located closer to the actual next school. In fact, there's also scenarios where a student actually could live closer to the school that they may otherwise go to, depending on what that community does.
Okay, I want to hear.
Let Mark.
Yeah, Mark.
Okay, Mark.
I'm holding firm with what we said before.
30 minutes.
30 minutes from what you said before.
I would lean towards 15 minutes, but I'd also like to look at the question you and maybe with some national data. I did some work on this years ago, which is probably out of date, but I would like for us to revisit the question.
Oliver? Or-
30 minutes is, I'm comfortable with.
School to school or?
Again, it's an average, so if it's 30 minutes school to school, that's an average, and I think John made a great point. In some cases, it's gonna be less, some cases, it's gonna be more. I actually lived in Danby and took 3 buses to get to school. I mean, it's what you do when you live in a rural community.
Connor?
If we're gonna look at this again, I'd like to see the report that Peter was talking about, and maybe the other things that we talked about when we initially discussed this, because it's been a little bit,
Who has that report
So when
electronically?
this report, you have to take the averages, it's, all the data is for the schools and how much time it, the trips are, and that's what you have to look at and doing the math, so.
I would just also, I'd want to hear from Brad, because Brad himself said, who did the report, that there were a lot of, when he presented it, he said there was a lot of problems with, so I guess I would want to hear
Well, I think there's
from
been a lot of
Brad
problems
too.
with all of this, but.
Yeah. I just, he was part of that report, and I want to, in his original presentation, he did say there were some issues with that. Okay, so those will both come back for June. So any other business to come in front of the board?
Good meeting, Madam Chair.
Do we have a motion then?
So
Move adjourned.
So moved to adjourn by John, seconded by Peter. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Thank you.